Hi there, it's Dr. Billy again. I wanted to provide you with another chapter quiz review. This is Chapter 8, Managerial and Organizational Ethics. Again, I know you all are reading the chapter on your own. It's different if we were meeting face to face and would have a lot of time to go over the material and have discussion and feedback among each other. So there is a lot of material I know that is not covered as far as the recordings that I do. But on this, I wanted to particularly with these chapter quizzes, I'm hoping that you're listening to the other PowerPoint voiceovers that I've done that are more lengthy, that cover more of the chapter. But again, the quiz, the purpose of this is just to hone in on some of the things that I would like for you to know to be tested on. So the subject of business ethics really can be addressed at several different levels. And there's personal, managerial, organizational, industrial, societal, and international. And so this chapter focuses mainly on managerial and organizational levels, and that's the level at which managers have the most impact. So integrity really is the quality that is most sought after by leaders. David Callahan is an author of a book titled The Cheating Culture: Why More Americans Are Doing Wrong to Get Ahead. And he argues that there are instances where cheating has increased and in society and in organizations. And he gives the following reasons. That there are higher level of inequality, so larger paycheck and incentive to cut corners and a bigger reward for winning. Widespread insecurities, the mentality that you need to cheat to get ahead, and so there's that temptation there to do so. There's cheating goes unchecked, failure of oversight by managers, and also that we in this country have a highly individualist culture and one that really glorifies wealth, status, and personal gratification. An Ethics Resource Center survey has shown that there are acts of misconduct that are commonly or most commonly observed in the workplace, and those include misrepresenting time that you work, discrimination, sexual harassment, abusive or intimidating behavior, withholding information that's needed, and also stealing, theft, and related fraud. So ethical issues typically arise at the personal level. You think about things, should you cheat on your income tax? Should you tell professor that you need a course to graduate when you don't? Should you share Netflix accounts, Hulu accounts? But they're at the managerial and organizational level as well, and also the global and societal levels, and it's become very difficult at the global and societal level for individual managers to have a direct effect on business ethics. And the manager's greatest impact really can be felt through what he or she does personally or as a member of the management team. And because of that, we are looking at ethical guidelines or guidelines that are discussed in this chapter so that, when you're looking for guidelines for ethical decision making, what are those that you can turn to make the right decision. So there are a number of different ethical principles that serve to guide as guides to managerial decision making, and they can be categorized in three different ways: the teleological or in-based, and deontological, duty-based, and then there's a virtue-based. And these principles are, we talked about this in the previous chapter, norms, so we're focusing on norms. So these are principles are normative in nature, on focusing on what we ought to do. So basically, an ethical principle is an ethical concept, guideline, or rule that if you applied when you're faced with an ethical decision or practice, will assist you in taking an ethical course of action. Now, the teleological theories focus on consequences or results of the actions that they produce. Utilitarianism is the ethical principle that states, well, we should always act as to produce the greatest ration of good to evil for everyone. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. And it's consequential principle of the teleological principle. One of the major deontological principles is the categorical imperative. And Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative is duty-based, and it's a duty-based principles of ethics, or as we stated earlier, a deontological principle. So it's a duty or an obligation, and that is, it's an action that is morally obligatory. And looking at principle of rights, one of the major problems with utilitarianism is it doesn't handle the issues of rights really very well. So moral rights are important, justifiable claims, and they do not depend on the legal system to be valid. They are the rights that people ought to have based on moral reasoning. The major philosophical principles of ethics include utilitarianism, rights, and justice. So the principle of justice, also known as the fairness principle, again, really doesn't handle well the idea of rights. It doesn't deal effectively with the principle of justice really either. One way to think about the principle of justice is to say that it involves the fair treatment of each person. Virtue ethics is another principle, and it merits consideration, and it focuses on the individual becoming more virtuous. And if you'll think these are rooted, the virtue ethics are rooted, if you've studied philosophy in Plato and Aristotle, you have studied those, I'm sure, and it's a system that is thought of that is centered in the heart of the person. And then moving on to the golden rule, we've heard this, I know you've heard this many times, was signaled out as really powerful, a powerful ethical principle among various groups that were studied. Virtue ethics was identified as an increasingly popular concept, but the golden rule, a number of studies have found it to be the most powerful and useful to managers, and it is known as the ethic of reciprocity. And it argues that if you want to be treated fairly, that you just treat others fairly. And if you want your privacy protected, respect the privacy of others. And the key to this is impartiality. And so according to this principle, the golden rule, we're not to make an exception of ourselves. So the golden rule personalizes business relations, and it also brings the idea of perceived fairness in business actions. So again, for managers, studies have found the golden rule to be the most useful ethical principle. So 7 practical tests have been proposed to assist managers in making ethical decisions. The test of common sense, the test of one's best self, the test of making something public, and the ethical tests presented really have been culled from real world experiences, and they're really more practical and hands-on in orientation. They're very, very pragmatic. The test of making something public, or the disclosure test, is really one of the most powerful of the ethical tests. The others are test of ventilation, purified idea, a test of the big four, and that was don't compromise your actions or decision by tempting others. Greed, speed, laziness, haziness are those four, and then the gag test. In looking at pressures exerted on employees by their superiors, one of the major consequences is that pressure is placed on subordinates or other organizational members to achieve results, and oftentimes ethics is compromised. And there was a study that was done that revealed that the perceived pressure to compromise ethics seemed to be felt most by those who are lower management, followed by those that are in the middle management. Best practices are those approaches, programs, policies, or guidelines that experience has shown produce the most effective results. So there are three key elements that need to exist if an ethical organizational culture is to be developed and sustained. And that is the presence of ethical leadership, and whether that's reflected by a board of directors, senior executive managers. Also a set of core ethical values, and that would be throughout the organization. And that's by way of policies, processes, and practices. And then formal ethics training. Looking at top management leadership or moral management, it's become an established principle of ethical leadership that the moral tone of an organization is set by top management. And it is the most important factor in strong ethical leadership, and that is in what leaders, looking at what leaders actually do. So there was an example given of a manufacturer of modern vacuum tubes, and there were about 10,000 tubes that had there was question about whether they had met the critical safety test. And so the plant manager was heard saying, "What are we going to do now?" And the vice president stepped up and said, we're going to scrap them. So he showed, as a top manager at the VP level, that he set the tone for the corporation and for many years, because every person that worked for them knew that the situation in which faulty products had been shipped before under pressure because of the time and budget. So it shows it's a good example of how leaders' actions and behavior communicate important messages to others in the organization. So looking at effective communication of ethical messages, management always carries the burden in terms of providing ethical leadership in this area, an important area of communication. And there are three very important communication principles: candor, fidelity, and confidentiality. And candor requires someone to be forthright and sincere and honest in your communication. And fidelity is communicating what's faithful to detail, or just being accurate. And then confidentiality, you really have to carefully measure what you should or should not inform others of if someone has confided in you. Another best practice I like to focus on is improving the firm's ethical climate, and that is making sure that you discipline anyone who violates ethical standards. And that's just to instill an ethical climate that all organizational members will believe in. So management must discipline violators of the organization's accepted ethical norms and standards. And a major reason that the general public and even employees of organizations have questioned businesses' sincerity uh, in wanting a more ethical environment has been their unwillingness to discipline violators. And there have been instances where Boeing fired its chief fiscal officer, who was really in line to become considered as a successor to the Boeing chairman and CEO. And it was found that he had violated their standards. And so it's very important that management discipline the violators of their ethical norms, because if they don't, if you see top level management being unethical, then how could they even expect you to, as lower level or even middle management, to instill ethical behavior in yourself? That wraps up just a review of the chapter quiz. I think this is a very interesting chapter, especially behavioral ethics is a field that's maturing. And, really looking at the psychological processes that occur when managers and employees really strive to do the right thing and making decisions, and how they design an ethical organizational culture. So when a moral organization is achieved, successes will feed back into the process, and it'll improve decisions, practices, and managers themselves. Good luck.